A typhoon once shattered an entire fleet and saved a nation. History is filled with moments just like this, where a sudden storm or a strange shift in the weather changed everything. In this journey, we will uncover 25 incredible times the forecast altered the course of human events. You will discover the hidden forces behind famous battles, mysterious disappearances, and world-altering disasters. How did a simple fog save an entire army from capture? What deep freeze crushed the ambitions of an emperor? The answers reveal a world where nature holds the final card. What single weather event do you think had the most profound impact on our world? Kublai Khan's ambition stretched across the sea. In 1274, the grandson of Genghis Khan sent a massive fleet of nearly 1,000 ships toward the islands of Japan. His Mongol warriors, seasoned by conquest, were joined by Korean and Chinese soldiers, creating an invasion force the Japanese samurai had never before faced. The initial battles were brutal. The samurai, accustomed to honorable single combat, were overwhelmed by the Mongols' organized, relentless tactics. The defenders were pushed back, their situation growing increasingly desperate. Just as a complete collapse seemed inevitable, the sky darkened and the sea began to churn. A typhoon of unbelievable fury slammed into the Mongol armada. The storm, which the Japanese would later call the kamikaze, or divine wind, ripped the invasion fleet apart. Ships were dashed against the rocks and sunk by the colossal waves, drowning thousands of soldiers and halting the invasion in a single, violent night. 7 years later, Kublai Khan tried again, sending an even larger fleet. Once more, just as his forces threatened to establish a beachhead, a second kamikaze typhoon roared out of the Pacific. This storm was even more devastating, obliterating the vast majority of the Mongol ships and stranding the surviving invaders on the beaches, where the samurai cut them down. The impact of these two storms was profound. They cemented a powerful national belief that Japan was divinely protected, a sacred land that the gods themselves would defend. This idea deeply influenced the nation's culture and its decision to isolate itself from the outside world for centuries. The very word kamikaze, born from these storms, would re-emerge during the Second World War, a haunting echo of a time when the weather itself decided the fate of a nation. How different would our world look if those two typhoons had never formed? Decades later, and far to the west, another wind was shaping the fate of empires. In 1588, the most powerful navy in the world, the Spanish Armada, set sail with a holy mission. King Philip II of Spain, a fervent Catholic, aimed to invade England, overthrow the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, and return the island nation to the fold of Rome. His fleet was a floating city of 130 ships, carrying 19,000 soldiers and 8,000 sailors. It was an overwhelming force, designed for one purpose: to clear the way for a massive invasion army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands. The English fleet, though more nimble and with better long-range guns, was drastically outnumbered. The early skirmishes in the English Channel were a tense affair. The English captains, including the famed Sir Francis Drake, refused to engage in a traditional boarding battle where the Spanish infantry would excel. Instead, they harried the edges of the Spanish formation, a crescent miles wide, using their superior cannons to snipe at the enemy from a distance. This could not stop the Armada's slow, methodical advance up the Channel. The Spanish plan was proceeding until the English launched a desperate and brilliant nighttime attack. They sent 8 old ships, packed with tar, gunpowder, and set ablaze, directly into the heart of the anchored Spanish fleet. These hell burners, or fire ships, created pure panic. Spanish captains, fearing catastrophic explosions, cut their anchor cables to escape, scattering their perfectly organized formation into chaos. This was the moment the weather took command. A powerful southwesterly gale, which the English would proudly call the Protestant wind, began to blow. It prevented the scattered Spanish ships from returning to their position to regroup and link up with their invasion army. Instead, the wind drove them north, away from the safety of the Channel, and into the stormy, treacherous North Sea. The Armada was forced to attempt a long and disastrous retreat home by sailing all the way around Scotland and Ireland, but the Protestant wind was not finished. It transformed into a series of brutal autumn storms that battered the fleeing Spanish ships for weeks. Galleons were driven onto the rocky shores of Ireland and Scotland. Supplies ran out, and men died of thirst and disease. Of the 130 ships that had set out with such confidence, fewer than half made it back to Spain. The defeat was catastrophic. It was not just a military loss, it was a divine judgment. For England, the storm had secured their independence, solidified Elizabeth I's legendary status, and guaranteed the survival of Protestantism in their land. For Spain, the loss marked the beginning of the end of its golden age and its dominance over the world's oceans. Once again, a shift in the wind had not just changed a battle, it had altered the religious and political landscape of Europe for centuries to come. Just a few years after that Protestant wind secured England's fate, another weather phenomenon would arise to help forge a new nation across the Atlantic. In August of 1776, General George Washington and his Continental Army faced annihilation. After a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Long Island, his outmatched forces were trapped on Brooklyn Heights, their backs to the swift, cold waters of the East River. Behind them, the full might of the British Army and its powerful navy was poised to close the trap. The British commander, General William Howe, was so confident of victory the next morning that he decided to finish the job after a good night's rest, avoiding a costly nighttime battle. For Washington and the cause of American independence, the sun rising on August 29th would mean certain capture and the war's end. Under the cover of darkness, Washington made a desperate decision. He would attempt a full retreat, evacuating his entire army of 9,000 men across the river to the relative safety of Manhattan. It was an almost impossible task. The slightest noise, a single glimmer of light, would alert the nearby British sentries and bring their overwhelming force crashing down. Then, as if answering a silent prayer, a deep and persistent fog began to creep over Long Island. It was not a light mist, but a thick, heavy blanket that muffled sound and reduced visibility to almost nothing. This fog became a miraculous cloak for the American army. All through the long, tense night, every available boat, from rowboats to sloops, was used to ferry the exhausted soldiers across the river. The oars were wrapped in cloth to silence their splash. Men whispered orders, moving with a disciplined quiet that defied their panic. The fog was so dense, it even concealed the boats from the British warships anchored just downstream. As dawn began to break, a large portion of the army was still on the Brooklyn shore. Washington himself remained, the last to leave, knowing that if the fog lifted, he would be captured. Yet the strange weather held, lingering long past its usual hour. The final boats crossed the river just as the morning sun finally began to burn the fog away. British troops advanced on the American lines, only to find them empty. The entire Continental Army had vanished into the mist. The consequences of that one foggy night are almost impossible to overstate. Had the clear, starry night given way to a normal dawn, Washington and his entire command would have been lost. The American Revolution, still in its infancy, would likely have been crushed before the Declaration of Independence was even 2 months old. Instead, the army lived to fight another day. That survival allowed the revolution to continue, to gain strength, and to ultimately succeed. A simple, natural fog, clinging to a riverbank, had preserved the fragile dream of a nation. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the peak of his power, commanding an army the modern world had never seen. His Grande Armée, a colossal force of over 600,000 men drawn from across his empire, marched into Russia in the summer of 1812. They were confident, seasoned by years of victory, and utterly convinced of their emperor's invincibility. The initial advance was a display of sheer might, pushing deep into the Russian heartland. Yet the Russian army, refusing to give a decisive battle, simply retreated, drawing the invaders further and further into a vast and unforgiving landscape. They left nothing behind. This was the scorched earth tactic, a strategy of absolute destruction. Villages, crops, and supplies were burned to ashes, denying Napoleon's army any means to live off the land. The further they marched, the more the land itself seemed to turn against them. Then the Russian winter arrived. It did not come gently or late. It exploded onto the scene with a vicious, early ferocity that stunned the ill-prepared invaders. Temperatures plunged to depths these men, many from the warmer climates of France and Italy, could not have conceived. The mercury dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Blizzards howled across the plains, wiping out roads and burying the landscape in deep, impassable snow. The cold became a weapon more deadly than any Russian cannon. Horses, essential for cavalry and transport, died by the thousands, their bodies freezing solid within hours. Men, still wearing their light summer uniforms, succumbed to frostbite and hypothermia in their sleep. Fingers, toes, and noses turned black from gangrene. Campfires provided little warmth, and the search for firewood often meant a death sentence in the blinding snow. Napoleon's military genius, which had relied on speed and decisive maneuver, was rendered utterly useless against an enemy he could not outthink or outfight. His supply lines, stretched over hundreds of miles, collapsed entirely. Starvation set in, discipline disintegrated. The Grande Armée was no longer an army, but a massive, desperate mob of freezing, starving individuals fighting only for survival. The retreat from Moscow was one of the most horrific chapters in military history. The same road they had marched down with such pride months before was now littered with the frozen dead, abandoned cannons, and the shattered remnants of a dream. Of the over 600,000 men who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 would ever stagger back across the border. This was not merely a defeat. It was an annihilation. The Russian winter had not just broken an army, it had shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility and broke the backbone of his empire. It was the beginning of his end, a stark lesson that no ambition, however grand, could triumph over the raw, unforgiving power of nature. While Napoleon's frozen army was a regional catastrophe, a different kind of weather disaster would soon engulf the entire world. Just a few years later, in 1816, the planet seemed to break from its natural rhythm. In the middle of July, people in the American state of Connecticut woke up to find their fields covered in ice. Farmers in Vermont shivered through blinding snowstorms. Across Western Europe, cold rains fell relentlessly, and summer never truly arrived. They called it the year without a summer, and the cause was not a change in the winds, but an event that had occurred a year earlier and half a world away. On an island in what is now Indonesia, the volcano Mount Tambora had erupted with a force unlike any in recorded history. The explosion was so violent it blew the mountain apart, instantly killing tens of thousands. But its true global impact came from what it injected high into the stratosphere, a colossal cloud of volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide gas. These tiny particles spread across the globe, acting like a giant sunshade that reflected sunlight back into space. The entire planet, especially the northern hemisphere, was plunged into a volcanic winter. The weather became a relentless agent of famine. Crops that needed summer warmth simply froze in the fields. Grain prices skyrocketed across Europe and North America. Desperate people broke into bakeries and stores in food riots. In Switzerland, the scarcity of oats to feed horses inspired a German inventor named Karl Dries to search for a new means of personal transport. His invention, a two-wheeled, human-powered running machine, was the direct ancestor of the modern bicycle. This global crisis also triggered one of the largest migrations in early American history. Thousands of families, realizing the thin, rocky soil of New England could no longer support them, abandoned their homes and began the trek westward to the fertile plains of the Midwest, accelerating the nation's expansion. Yet from this gloomy, storm-racked summer also came a spark of profound creativity. A young woman named Mary Shelley was vacationing in Switzerland, forced indoors day after day by the abnormally cold, stormy weather. To pass the time, she and her famous companions, the poets Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley, challenged each other to write ghost stories. Inspired by the tempestuous atmosphere outside her window, Mary conceived a tale of a scientist who defied nature itself. That story became Frankenstein, a novel born from a summer that never was, a timeless masterpiece forged directly by the ashes of a distant volcano. The same sun that had failed to appear during the year without a summer now beat down with a relentless, punishing heat on the American Great Plains. For years, the land had been generous. A period of unusually good rainfall and high wheat prices in the 1920s encouraged a farming boom. with settlers plowing under millions of acres of native prairie grass that had held the soil in place for millennia. The earth was seen as an endless resource, a green gold mine. Then, in the early 1930s, the rains stopped. The drought began, and it did not end for nearly a decade. This was not merely a dry spell, it was a climatic catastrophe, made infinitely worse by human hands. The deep roots of the buffalo grass were gone, and with nothing to anchor it, the topsoil turned to a fine, lifeless powder. Winds that once whispered across the prairie now howled, lifting the earth itself into the sky. They called these storms black blizzards. They were not like ordinary dust storms. These were towering walls of choking, blackened soil, sometimes 2 miles high, rolling across the landscape with the force of a tsunami. Day turned into an eerie, pitch-black night. The dust was so thick and static-charged it shorted out car engines and crept through the smallest cracks in windows and doors, coating the insides of homes with a fine, silt-like layer. Children wore dust masks to school, and families slept with wet cloths over their faces to avoid inhaling the abrasive particles. The term dust pneumonia entered the vocabulary, a deadly illness that filled victims' lungs with mud. Farms simply vanished, buried under dunes of what was once fertile soil. The economic and human toll was staggering. Widespread poverty gripped entire states in a region now dubbed the Dust Bowl. With no crops and no hope, hundreds of thousands of families made an agonizing decision. They packed whatever they could into battered trucks and old cars, becoming refugees in their own country. They were known as Akis and Arkies, nicknames for those fleeing Oklahoma and Arkansas, and they streamed down Route 66 toward the promised land of California. This mass exodus, one of the largest in American history, profoundly reshaped the nation. The migrants faced bitter prejudice and desperate hardship in California, a story immortalized in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Yet their journey also dispersed a generation across the West, altering the nation's demographic and cultural landscape forever. The Dust Bowl was a stark lesson in ecological balance, a painful reminder that the weather does not act alone, and that our own choices can turn a climate shift into a civilization-altering disaster. 4 years of meticulous planning had come down to a single weather forecast. In the first days of June, 1944, the greatest invasion force ever assembled lay poised along the southern coast of England. Operation Overlord, the Allied plan to storm the beaches of Normandy, was ready. Yet its success or failure rested not on the number of ships or the courage of the soldiers, but on the wind, the clouds, and the waves. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible decision. The invasion required a specific combination of conditions: a low tide at dawn to expose German beach obstacles, a full moon for paratrooper operations, and, most critically, relatively calm seas and clear skies. The first week of June brought a savage North Atlantic storm, churning the channel into a fury and blanketing the sky with thick, low clouds. All the elements of nature seemed to be conspiring against the Allies. Postponing the invasion meant waiting for another lunar cycle, losing the element of surprise, and possibly the entire campaigning season. Launching into the storm meant sending thousands of men to their deaths in sinking landing craft and grounding the Air Force. The weight of the free world pressed on one man, a soft-spoken Scottish meteorologist named Group Captain James Stagg. Stagg led a small, secret team of forecasters who were piecing together fragmented data from weather ships and clandestine reports. His task was to find a break in the storm, a sliver of opportunity that the German forecasters would miss. On June 4th, with the invasion fleet already partially at sea, Stagg made a gut-wrenching recommendation to Eisenhower. He predicted the terrible weather would continue, forcing a historic 24-hour delay. The following day, as the storm raged exactly as Stagg had forecast, the atmosphere at Allied headquarters was thick with tension. Then Stagg returned with a new, audacious prediction. He foresaw a brief and temporary lull in the storm for the morning of June 6th. It was not good weather, merely a period of less bad weather. The German High Command, relying on forecasting from a region where the weather systems originated, was certain no invasion was possible. Their senior meteorologists assured them the conditions were too severe. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, So confident in the forecast, even left his post in Normandy to visit his wife for her birthday. This was the critical window. Eisenhower, trusting his meteorologist over the evidence of his own eyes, gave the fateful order, "Okay, let's go." On the morning of June 6th, the channel was still rough, the skies still gray. But it was enough. The Allies achieved total surprise, their landing craft hitting the beaches as the German defenders believed they were safe from attack. The successful establishment of the beachhead that day was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Without that accurate, courageous forecast, the invasion would have been a catastrophic failure, splintered against the same storm that lulled the enemy into a false sense of security. The entire timeline of the war, and the future of Europe, hinged on one man's ability to read the sky. A different kind of fog, one born not of the sea but of industry, would descend upon London a century later with equally profound consequences. In December 1952, a great anticyclone settled over the British capital, a massive high-pressure system that created an unusual and deadly meteorological trap. The air near the ground grew colder than the air above it, a phenomenon known as a temperature inversion. This invisible lid sealed the city, preventing the normal winds from dispersing the constant output of millions of coal-burning home fireplaces, factory smokestacks, and diesel-powered buses. For 5 days, the poison had nowhere to go. What began as a familiar London pea soup thickened into something entirely new and terrifying. It was a greasy, yellow-black smog that blotted out the sun at noon. Visibility collapsed to just a few feet, bringing all transportation to a standstill. Ambulances stopped running. People became lost and disoriented in their own neighborhoods. The smog was not just outside. It seeped relentlessly indoors, creeping under doors and through window frames, leaving a sooty film on furniture and a bitter, acidic taste in the back of the throat. The human cost was horrific, yet it unfolded with a quiet, insidious lethality. The smog's particles, a toxic cocktail of soot and sulfur dioxide, attacked the respiratory systems of the most vulnerable, the elderly, the very young, and those already suffering from lung conditions. Mortality rates skyrocketed, funeral parlors ran out of coffins, and florists exhausted their supplies of flowers. The official death toll in the immediate aftermath was shockingly undercounted, but later studies revealed the true, staggering scale. An estimated 12,000 people died prematurely from respiratory failure and related complications, with tens of thousands more falling severely ill. This was not an act of a distant god or a foreign enemy. It was a man-made catastrophe, and the weather had simply held up a mirror, forcing a society to confront the deadly price of its own progress. The public outrage and the overwhelming evidence of the smog's toll created an unstoppable political momentum for change. After years of investigation and debate, Parliament passed the landmark Clean Air Act of 1956. This pioneering legislation established smoke-free zones, promoted the use of cleaner fuels, and moved power stations away from populated areas. It was one of the world's first and most significant pieces of modern environmental law, a direct response to a disaster written in the city's very air. The Great Smog of London proved that a weather event could do more than sink fleets or save armies. It could awaken a collective conscience and force humanity to legislate a cleaner, safer future. Spain's vast empire was built on a river of New World gold. For over 2 centuries, a carefully orchestrated convoy system, the Spanish treasure fleet, was the economic lifeblood of the crown. These galleons, laden with silver from Mexico and Peru, gold from Colombia, and emeralds from the Andes, sailed in armed flotillas to fend off pirates and rival navies. In the summer of 1715, a particularly rich fleet, the Plate Fleet of that year, finally set sail from Havana, Cuba, for its transatlantic crossing to Cadiz. It was a floating fortune, carrying the accumulated wealth of an entire year's colonial production, but the fleet had been delayed by bureaucracy and repairs, and its departure pushed them directly into the most dangerous season for Atlantic hurricanes. Just a week into their voyage, as the ship sailed north along the coast of Florida, the barometer plummeted. The sky turned a sickly green, and the wind began to scream. A hurricane of unimaginable force slammed into the unsuspecting armada. For the sailors and passengers trapped aboard the wooden galleons, the world dissolved into chaos. Mountainous waves, taller than the ship's masts, smashed into the hulls. The wind shredded sails and snapped masts like twigs. 11 of the 12 ships were torn apart and driven onto the razor-sharp coral reefs, their precious cargo spilling into the raging surf. Over 1,000 souls, from wealthy merchants to enslaved oarsmen, drowned in the violent, churning water. The economic shockwave was immediate and severe. The financial loss was a staggering blow to the Spanish treasury, which was already strained by the costs of endless European wars. King Philip V was plunged into a deeper fiscal crisis, his dreams of continental ambition washed away with the silver bars. Yet from this colossal tragedy, a new legacy was born along the Florida shoreline. The coast where the ships met their end became known forever as the Treasure Coast. For centuries, the sea has been slowly giving up its secrets. Modern treasure hunters, armed with metal detectors and sophisticated sonar, have recovered millions of dollars worth of gold coins and artifacts from the sandy bottom. Even today, after a strong storm churns the seabed, beachcombers can sometimes find a glint of Spanish silver in the surf, a tangible piece of history tossed ashore by the very waves that claimed it 300 years ago. Deep in the jungles of Central America, the stone ruins of towering pyramids stand as silent witnesses to a vanished world. The classic Maya civilization, at its peak around 800 AD, was a breathtaking tapestry of art, astronomy, and architecture. They built vast cities like Tikal and Palenque, their temples scraping the sky, and developed a calendar of astonishing complexity. Then, within a span of about 100 years, this vibrant society crumbled. The great cities were abandoned to the jungle, their populations scattered, and their knowledge seemingly lost. For centuries, the reason behind this collapse was one of history's greatest enigmas. Was it warfare, rebellion, or perhaps a terrible disease? The answer, it turns out, was written not in their stone carvings, but in the very climate they depended on. Scientists drilling into the bottom of ancient lakes and analyzing the slow growth of cave stalagmites have uncovered a chilling story. These natural archives hold a record of rainfall stretching back over 1,000 years, and the data reveals a devastating pattern. Starting around the 9th century, the Maya heartland was struck by a series of extreme, multi-decadal droughts. These were not simply dry seasons, they were profound shifts in the weather that could last for 30 years or more. Imagine the slow, creeping terror of watching your primary water source, the reservoirs that sustained your city through the annual dry season, slowly evaporate and turn to mud, year after year after year. In a civilization entirely dependent on maize agriculture, a succession of failed rainy seasons meant catastrophic crop failure. Famine would have spread through the population, weakening millions. The social contract that bound people to their divine kings, who were believed to intercede with the gods for rain and fertility, would have shattered. When the prayers of the rulers failed and the skies remained relentlessly clear, their authority evaporated along with the water. The result was likely widespread unrest, internal warfare over scarce resources, and a final, desperate migration. People simply walked away from the magnificent stone plazas and temples, seeking survival elsewhere. While debates continue among historians about the role of other factors, the paleoclimate evidence presents a compelling case. A sophisticated civilization, one that had thrived for centuries, was ultimately brought low not by invaders, but by a persistent and unforgiving shift in the weather. It is a humbling reminder that even the most advanced societies are built upon a fragile pact with the natural world, a pact that can be broken by a long, silent drought. A slow, creeping chill descended upon Europe for 5 long centuries. From the 1400s to the 1800s, a climatic period now known as the Little Ice Age gripped the continent. This was not a single cataclysmic storm, but a persistent, grinding cold that rewrote the rules of daily life. Glaciers in the Alps began a relentless advance, swallowing entire farms and villages. In London, the River Thames froze solid so regularly that they held frost fairs right on the ice, complete with temporary shops, roasting pits, and even printing presses stamping souvenir certificates. But this was no festive curiosity for the millions who worked the land. The cooler temperatures meant dramatically shorter growing seasons. A single late frost in spring or an early one in autumn could wipe out a year's harvest, turning abundance into desperation. This environmental pressure cooker directly fueled some of the most pivotal moments in European history. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which killed millions across the continent, was triggered by years of relentlessly cold, wet summers that rotted grain in the fields. Centuries later, the deep freeze was still exerting its influence. In the 1780s, a series of terrible harvests caused by harsh weather led to soaring bread prices and widespread hunger in France. This desperation amplified the public fury against the monarchy, pouring fuel on the simmering discontent that would explode into the French Revolution. Yet from this era of hardship also came unexpected beauty. The perpetual winter landscapes inspired artists like Pieter Bruegel the Elder, whose paintings of hunters in the snow and frozen village ponds are not just works of art, but frozen documents of a world in the grip of a deep chill. The Little Ice Age proves that climate is not just about dramatic disasters, but also about the slow, inexorable pressure that can bend the arc of history, toppling kings and inspiring masterpieces from the depths of the cold. Nearly 500 years before the mud of the Great War, another rain-soaked field in France decided the fate of kings. In October 1415, the 100 Years' War between England and France reached a desperate climax. The young King Henry V of England, his army ravaged by disease and a long campaign, was trying to make a fighting retreat to the English-held coast. He was cornered near the village of Agincourt by a French force that outnumbered his by at least 3-1, perhaps even 5-1. The French nobility, confident and eager for glory, were certain of victory. They would crush this impudent English army and capture its king. Then the skies opened. For days before the battle, a cold, heavy autumn rain fell without pause. It saturated the recently plowed field between two dense woods, a narrow bottleneck where the battle would be fought. This was not just wet ground, it was a deep, clinging quagmire. The freshly turned soil became a treacherous soup of mud, a detail that would prove more decisive than any battle plan. The French battle strategy relied on a massive, overwhelming cavalry charge by heavily armored knights, the medieval equivalent of tanks. They intended to ride down the English longbowmen, who were mostly commoners, and then engage the outnumbered English men-at-arms in a melee. But when the charge began, the French knights found themselves slogging through a nightmare. Their heavy steel plate armor, a mark of status and power, became a deadly liability. Each step was a struggle, the thick mud sucking at their boots and weighing them down with dozens of pounds of clinging earth. The horses, also armored, floundered and sank into the mire, their charge slowing to an exhausted, chaotic crawl. This gave the English longbowmen all the time they needed. They had driven sharpened stakes into the ground before their positions as a defense against cavalry, but the mud was their greatest ally. The French advance became a slow-moving, tightly packed target. The English unleashed volley after volley of arrows in high, arching shots. The arrows themselves did not always pierce the best plate armor, but they found their marks in the exposed joints of armor, in the faces of the knights, and in the struggling, unprotected horses. The effect was carnage. Knights who were knocked over could barely stand back up in the deep mud, often drowning in their helmets under the weight of their own armor and the press of fallen men and horses. When the surviving French knights finally reached the English lines, they were so exhausted from wading through the bog that they could barely lift their weapons. The English men-at-arms, who had chosen to fight on foot, were far more mobile on the firm ground they had held from the start. They cut down the fatigued French soldiers with ease. The battle became a slaughter. By the end of the day, the French army was annihilated. Thousands of the French nobility lay dead in the mud, a catastrophic blow to the nation's ruling class. The victory seemed so miraculous that it was seen as a sign of divine favor for Henry V, a legend that William Shakespeare would immortalize centuries later. Agincourt cemented the fearsome reputation of the English longbow, a weapon that, when paired with the right weather, could humble the greatest knights in Europe. The relentless rain had turned the field into a trap, proving that the terrain under an army's feet could be as important as the courage in its heart. Spring arrived with a deceptive warmth that March of 1888. People in New York and Washington walked outside without their heavy coats, enjoying the mild air and the promise of an early end to winter. There was no warning, no sign of the cataclysm about to be unleashed from the Great Lakes and the Atlantic, converging into a single, monstrous storm. The blizzard struck with a sudden, shocking fury. Within hours, the temperature plummeted 50 degrees, and hurricane-force winds began driving snow in horizontal sheets. It was not a gentle snowfall, it was a white darkness that swallowed entire cities. For 3 days, the storm raged, dumping as much as 50 inches of snow in some places, with drifts piling up to the second stories of buildings. The world outside simply vanished. The chaos was absolute. Above ground, the lifeblood of the modern city was its infrastructure, and the storm severed it completely. 200 trains were stranded in massive snowdrifts, their passengers trapped for days without food or heat. The thousands of telegraph and telephone poles that crisscrossed the urban landscape, the nervous system of commerce and communication, were snapped like toothpicks by the weight of ice and the ferocious wind. New York City was completely cut off from Washington, D.C., and from the rest of the world. The silence was as terrifying as the cold. People died just feet from their own front doors, becoming disoriented and freezing in the blinding whiteout. Over 400 people lost their lives, many of them linemen who died in courageous, futile attempts to restore the telegraph lines. When the snow finally stopped and the cities began the slow, arduous task of digging out, the lesson was brutally clear. Their proud, above-ground systems of transport and communication were dangerously vulnerable. The public outcry was immediate and forceful, demanding that such a catastrophe never happen again. This collective pressure sparked an engineering revolution. City planners and politicians, shaken by the complete breakdown, authorized a massive, historic project to move the essential wires underground. This was the birth of our modern underground utility lines, a direct response to the blizzard's destruction. The disaster also provided the final, undeniable argument for a project that had been debated for years: the New York City subway system. If trains could be buried by snow, then the trains themselves must be buried underground. The blizzard of 1888, in its immense destruction, forced a fundamental redesign of the modern city. It taught humanity to build not just for convenience, but for resilience, creating an urban landscape that could survive the next great act of nature. The dream began with 7 healthy cows, sleek and fat, grazing peacefully on the riverbank. Then 7 more emerged from the water, but these were gaunt and starved, a terrifying sight that devoured the healthy animals whole. This was the vision that haunted the Pharaoh of Egypt, a divine riddle that none of his own wise men could unravel. It was a Hebrew slave, Joseph, who provided the stunning interpretation. The 7 fat cows, he explained, were 7 years of agricultural abundance. The 7 lean cows foretold 7 years of famine, so severe it would wipe the memory of the good years from the land. Joseph did not stop with the forecast. He offered a survival plan. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a commissioner to store 1/5 of all the harvest during the plentiful years, creating a national grain reserve to see the kingdom through the coming catastrophe. The Pharaoh was so impressed, he placed Joseph himself in charge of the entire nation's food supply. This ancient story, told in the book of Genesis, has echoed for millennia. But could a weather prediction so precise have a basis in climatic reality? Modern science has unearthed a startling answer deep within the Nile itself. Researchers analyzing core samples of sediment from the riverbed have found evidence of dramatic, long-term fluctuations in the Nile's water levels. These sediment layers act as a historical record, and they reveal periods of drastic, persistent drought that could easily align with a 7-year famine. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt, its annual flood depositing fertile silt across the farmland. A failure of that flood meant starvation. The biblical narrative perfectly captures the existential terror of a society living at the mercy of a river. Joseph's advice transformed Egypt's vulnerability into immense power. By stockpiling grain, he turned the nation into the sole food bank for the entire region. When the drought struck, it was not just Egypt that suffered. People from surrounding lands, including Joseph's own brothers, were forced to travel to Egypt to buy food, bowing before the very brother they had once betrayed. This act of meteorological foresight did more than avert a famine. It elevated the Israelite people from a family of nomadic shepherds to honored guests, and then to a position of significant influence within the most powerful empire on earth. This period of favor and growth set the entire stage for the next great chapter in their story. Generations later, a pharaoh who knew nothing of Joseph would see their numbers as a threat, leading to enslavement and the eventual exodus. A single interpretation of a weather warning, preserved in both scripture and sediment, set in motion a chain of events that would shape the identity of a people and the course of religious history. The same winds that saved England from the Spanish Armada 100 years earlier would now conspire to reshape its very government. By 1688, King James II, a devout Catholic, had alienated nearly every powerful faction in his predominantly Protestant kingdom. His promotion of Catholics to high office and the birth of a male heir, who would secure a Catholic dynasty, created a crisis. A group of powerful English nobles made a secret, desperate invitation to the Dutch ruler, William of Orange. William was a Protestant champion and, crucially, the husband of James's own Protestant daughter, Mary. He assembled a massive invasion fleet of over 400 ships, an armada larger than the Spanish one, and set sail for England in November. The plan was incredibly risky. The English Navy, loyal to King James, was patrolling the Channel, waiting to intercept and destroy the Dutch fleet in a pitched battle. As William's ships entered the narrow waters, the English fleet moved to engage. Then, the weather intervened with what historians would call a second Protestant wind. A powerful and persistent easterly gale began to blow, straight from the continent toward England. This wind was a double-edged sword of destiny. It blew directly into the faces of the English fleet, pinning their ships in harbor and making it impossible for them to sail out and confront the invaders. For William's armada, that same easterly was a perfect, powerful tailwind. It swept his ships safely and swiftly down the entire length of the English Channel, pushing them past the trapped English navy without a single cannon being fired. William landed on English soil completely unopposed. This unhindered landing was a psychological blow from which King James could not recover. His confidence shattered, his support evaporating, and seeing the divine favor in the Protestant wind, he ultimately fled to France. This was the Glorious Revolution, a transfer of power achieved with remarkable little bloodshed. William and Mary were offered the throne, but under a new set of rules, the Bill of Rights. This landmark document established the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy, laying the foundation for the constitutional monarchy that defines Britain to this day. It was a profound shift away from absolute royal power, a concept of governance that would deeply influence the American Constitution a century later. All of it was set in motion by a fortuitous easterly gale that cleared a path not just for ships, but for an entirely new political era. While Rome mourned the death of a dictator, the sky itself seemed to grieve. In the years following the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, ancient writers recorded a strange and terrifying phenomenon. The Mediterranean world was plunged into a deep, unshakable cold. The sun grew dim, as if shrouded by a permanent veil, and summer failed to arrive. Crops withered in the fields, leading to widespread famine and desperate food riots. For centuries, this was seen as a literary omen, a dark portent of the Republic's death throes. But what if this was not a metaphor? What if the political chaos that consumed Rome was triggered by a real, physical disaster happening half a world away? Scientists drilling into ancient ice in Greenland have uncovered stunning evidence. Locked within those ice cores are layers of volcanic ash and sulfate deposits dating precisely to 43 BC. The chemical fingerprint points to a colossal eruption, one of the largest in the last 2,500 years. The suspected source, Okmok Volcano in Alaska. An eruption that massive would have blasted an immense cloud of sulfur dioxide gas and fine ash high into the stratosphere, where it would spread across the globe. This veil of particles would reflect sunlight back into space, creating a volcanic winter. For the Roman world, this meant years of cold, shortened growing seasons, and relentless rain that ruined what little harvest remained. Imagine the social and political tension in Rome following Caesar's murder. The power struggle between his assassins, Brutus and Cassius, and his avengers, Mark Antony and Octavian, was already pushing the state toward civil war. Now, add a sudden, inexplicable famine. The price of grain skyrocketed. The populace, already volatile, grew increasingly desperate and angry. The ruling class, struggling to explain the climate shock, likely saw it as divine wrath or political bad omens, fueling further paranoia and instability. This environmental crisis crippled the economy and shattered public order, making a peaceful political resolution almost impossible. The volcanic winter did not cause the fall of the Roman Republic by itself, but it acted as a powerful accelerant. It poured fuel on the fires of civil conflict, weakening the social fabric and creating the perfect conditions for a strongman to promise stability and bread. Out of that decade of cold and hunger, Octavian would eventually emerge victorious, becoming Augustus, the first Roman emperor. A volcanic eruption on the other side of the planet may have quietly cleared the path for the Roman Empire, proving that a shift in the global climate can echo in the halls of power for centuries. A different kind of American victory was forged not by winter's cold, but by a tropical fury. In December 1814, a powerful British invasion fleet of over 50 ships entered the Gulf of Mexico. Their target was the bustling port of New Orleans, the gateway to the entire Louisiana territory. Aboard were 10,000 of Britain's best soldiers, hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Their mission was simple: to seize the city, control the Mississippi River, and potentially tear the young United States in half. But the War of 1812 had already ended. Diplomats in Europe had signed the Treaty of Ghent 2 weeks earlier. In an age without telegraphs or radio, the news was still weeks away, sailing slowly across the Atlantic. The battle for New Orleans was about to be fought over a war that was already over. As the British fleet maneuvered into position for the assault, the skies over the Gulf began to churn. A hurricane of immense power roared ashore, directly into the path of the invasion force. The storm was a catastrophe for the British. It sank several of their warships, sending heavy cannons and vital supplies to the bottom. It scattered transport vessels, separating troops from their commanders and their equipment. Most critically, it drove surviving ships into the swamps and bayous surrounding the city, bogging down the advance and drenching the army's gunpowder. The hurricane had turned the landscape into a waterlogged nightmare. When the battered British forces finally regrouped and began their march, they were exhausted, disorganized, and critically weakened. They faced a ragtag American army commanded by General Andrew Jackson, a force cobbled together from regular soldiers, free African-American militiamen, pirates, and frontiersmen. Jackson used the extra time granted by the storm to build strong defensive earthworks. The overconfident British commanders, their plans shattered by the hurricane, ordered a frontal assault directly into the teeth of the American defenses. It was a slaughter. Protected behind their ramparts, Jackson's riflemen and artillery mowed down the advancing redcoats. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties in less than 2 hours, while American losses were minimal. The victory was immediate and total. When Andrew Jackson rode into Washington, D.C. as a national hero, his legend was sealed not just by his tactical genius, but by the hurricane that had softened up his formidable enemy. That fame propelled him directly to the presidency, shaping American politics for a generation. The battle itself, though fought after the peace, had a profound consequence. It convinced the American public they had won the war decisively, fostering a powerful new sense of national identity and unity. The storm had ensured that the vast Louisiana Purchase would remain firmly in American hands, its fury quietly redirecting the destiny of a continent. The fields of Waterloo were saturated with a meaning beyond mere water. On the night of June 17, 1815, a torrential summer downpour unleashed itself upon the Belgian countryside. It was not a gentle rain, but a relentless, drenching deluge that continued for hours, turning the rolling farmland into a vast, sticky quagmire. For the soldiers huddled in the open, it was a miserable prelude to battle. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a catastrophe in the making. His entire battle plan, perfected over a decade of European conquest, depended on speed, surprise, and the overwhelming force of his grand battery of artillery. He intended to begin his assault at first light, shattering the Allied lines under the command of the Duke of Wellington with a massive, concentrated cannonade before his enemies could properly organize. But the rain had stolen his opening move. The sodden ground was too soft. His heavy cannon, the keys to his victory, sank into the deep mud. Moving them into their ideal firing positions was an agonizingly slow process, costing Napoleon the entire morning. Each passing hour was a gift to his opponent, Wellington, who used the time to strengthen his defensive ridge. More critically, it was a lifeline for the Prussian army under the determined Gebhard von Blücher. Napoleon had believed he had knocked the Prussians out of the fight days earlier, but Blücher was marching his weary men toward the sound of the guns. The delayed start gave them the precious time they needed to complete their grueling march and begin arriving on the French flank. When Napoleon finally launched his main infantry attack in the early afternoon, it was against a reinforced and fully prepared enemy. The battle raged with a ferocious intensity, but the French Emperor was now fighting on two fronts. The arrival of the fresh Prussian troops shattered French morale and turned the tide irrevocably. The delay caused by a single night of rain had allowed Napoleon's two enemies to unite, something his entire strategy was designed to prevent. His final, desperate gamble, the attack of his elite Imperial Guard, was broken and thrown back. The defeat was total. Napoleon was forced to abdicate for a second and final time, his dreams of empire extinguished forever on that muddy field. The map of Europe was redrawn at the Congress of Vienna, establishing a balance of power that would last for decades. A summer storm, by stalling the most famous artilleryman in history, had decided the fate of a continent. A torrent of water poured from the sky, a relentless series of cyclones that seemed to have no end. In the summer of 1931, a perfect storm of meteorological disasters converged on central China. Exceptionally heavy winter snows in the mountains melted rapidly under heavy spring rains, and then a succession of powerful typhoons slammed into the coast, pushing this colossal volume of water into the country's great river systems. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, and the Huai River all burst their ancient banks simultaneously. The result was an apocalyptic flood that submerged an area the size of England, turning 80,000 square miles of farmland and villages into a vast, churning inland sea. The initial wave of destruction drowned countless thousands, but that was only the beginning. As the stagnant water lingered for months, it became a breeding ground for cholera, typhus, and other deadly diseases. The ensuing famine, as crops were destroyed and supply lines severed, completed the catastrophe. This was not merely a flood, it was a demographic earthquake. Historians estimate the final death toll to be between 1 and 4 million people, making it arguably the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history. The social and political fabric of China, already frayed by weak central authority and internal conflict, tore completely. The nationalist government, the Kuomintang, was overwhelmed and paralyzed by the scale of the crisis. Its inability to mount an effective relief effort or provide for the millions of displaced refugees shattered its legitimacy in the eyes of the peasantry. Into this void of desperation stepped the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. While the nationalists appeared distant and incompetent, communist organizers moved into the devastated regions, providing grassroots aid and promising radical land reform. They harnessed the widespread anger and despair, turning a natural catastrophe into a powerful political opportunity. The loyalty they cultivated among the rural poor in those flooded lands became the foundation of their popular support. The Great Flood of 1931 did not create the Chinese Civil War, but it critically weakened the established government and gave the communists the opening they needed to build a revolutionary base. A seemingly unstoppable force of nature had washed away the old order, setting the stage for a new, communist China that would reshape global politics for the rest of the 20th century. That same year, the fragile American Revolution was just one harsh winter away from collapse. By late 1776, General George Washington's army was a shadow of the force that had escaped Brooklyn. The enlistments for most of his soldiers were set to expire at the end of December, and men were deserting in droves, demoralized by a string of defeats and the bitter cold. The dream of independence was freezing to death in the Pennsylvania winter. Washington knew he had to strike one bold, decisive blow before his army simply melted away. His target was Trenton, New Jersey, held by a garrison of 1,500 Hessian mercenaries fighting for the British. The plan was audacious and desperate: a nighttime crossing of the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, followed by a 9-mile march to launch a surprise attack at dawn. The weather that night was a brutal paradox, a force of both misery and salvation. A biting nor'easter swept through the valley, bringing sleet, snow, and a wind that cut like a knife. The soldiers, many without proper shoes, left bloody footprints in the snow. The cold was so intense it was its own kind of enemy, yet this same freeze provided an unexpected advantage. It hardened the normally soft, muddy roads, creating a solid surface that allowed Washington's men to drag their crucial cannons and artillery wagons all the way to Trenton. Without that frozen ground, the heavy guns would have sunk into the mire, rendering the attack useless. The crossing itself was a nightmare of drifting ice and howling winds, taking hours longer than planned, but they made it. Then, the weather shifted again in their favor. As the exhausted Continentals began their march toward Trenton, the precipitation turned to a mix of freezing rain and wet snow. For the Hessian garrison, this meant a miserable, confined Christmas. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, had received warnings of a possible attack, but the severe weather convinced him that no army would be mad enough to march in such conditions. He canceled patrols, and his soldiers, having celebrated the holiday, were unprepared and disorganized. The sleet and snow masked the sound of the approaching American columns and kept the Hessians huddled indoors. At 8 in the morning, Washington's forces struck from two sides, achieving total surprise. The battle was short and fierce. The Americans captured nearly the entire Hessian force along with desperately needed muskets, gunpowder, and supplies. The victory at Trenton was far more than a tactical win. It was a psychological earthquake. The stunning success, against all odds and the elements, convinced many of Washington's men to re-enlist. It breathed new life and hope into a cause that had been on the verge of extinguishment. A bitter freeze and a timely thaw had not just won a battle. They had saved the revolution itself from dissolving into the cold. Even the modern world of satellite forecasts and radar was not immune to a sudden, monstrous act of nature. In late October 1991, a truly freakish event unfolded off the coast of New England, a meteorological nightmare that would become legend. It began with 3 distinct weather systems, each powerful on its own, converging in the North Atlantic: a massive high-pressure system over southeastern Canada, a deep low-pressure system moving up from the coast, and the lingering energy of Hurricane Grace, which had drifted north from the tropics. These 3 forces did not simply pass by one another. They collided and began to feed off each other's energy, creating a self-sustaining weather bomb. Meteorologists at the National Weather Service were stunned, watching their models depict a storm of unprecedented ferocity taking shape, a storm they officially dubbed the Halloween nor'easter. The ocean became a seething, chaotic hellscape. Wave heights reached staggering, theoretical limits, with data buoys recording individual waves over 100 feet tall, higher than a 10-story building. The wind screamed at hurricane force for days on end, whipping the sea into a frothing, impossible terrain. It was into this maelstrom that the 72-foot swordfishing boat Andrea Gale sailed. The crew of 6 experienced fishermen, based out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, radioed their last communication on October 28th, describing seas of unimaginable violence. The boat and all hands were lost, swallowed by the storm's fury. This tragedy, while a profound human loss, created a cultural and scientific benchmark. Author Sebastian Junger's book, The Perfect Storm, immortalized the event, giving the storm its famous name and exploring the raw, human drama of those who challenged the sea. For meteorologists, it became a vital case study in how multiple weather systems can interact to create something far greater than the sum of its parts, fundamentally changing how we model and understand extreme storm development. For the public, the story entered our collective consciousness as the ultimate symbol of nature's indomitable power, a sobering reminder that for all our technology and bravado, we remain at the mercy of the elements. The very phrase "perfect storm" entered our language, used to describe any situation where a rare combination of circumstances leads to an unavoidable catastrophe. The thunder that echoed over the Crimean Peninsula one October night in 1854 was a grim omen. A violent thunderstorm erupted, drenching the battlefield at Balaclava with a cold, relentless rain. While the soldiers huddled in their tents, this downpour was silently sabotaging the very tools meant to protect them. The cardboard cartridges containing the gunpowder for the British artillery shells were soaked through. By morning, a significant portion of their ammunition was rendered useless, the damp powder failing to ignite properly or firing with wildly inconsistent range. This critical weakness went unnoticed by the commanders who would, hours later, issue the most infamous order in British military history. The Light Brigade, 600 magnificent cavalrymen, were commanded to charge straight down a long valley, a natural kill zone flanked on three sides by Russian artillery. The plan, however flawed, depended on a suppressing barrage from those very British guns to soften the enemy positions and cover the advance. As the brigade began its gallop into what Alfred, Lord Tennyson, would later call the Valley of Death, the supporting cannon fire was sporadic and ineffective. Shells that should have screamed overhead to silence the Russian gunners fell short or failed to explode at all. The Russian cannon crews, untouched by the weakened bombardment, had all the time in the world to aim. They poured a horrific crossfire into the trapped brigade from the front and both sides. The cavalrymen were not just charging into a tactical error. They were charging into a storm of shot and shell that should have been, but never was, subdued by their own artillery. The result was a slaughter of legendary proportions. In mere minutes, the brigade was torn to pieces, with over 100 men killed and hundreds more wounded. The charge became a permanent symbol of the blind courage of the common soldier and the catastrophic incompetence of their leaders. But behind the famous blunder lay a simple, tragic fact of weather. The rain the night before had stolen their covering fire, turning a desperate gamble into a foretold doom, and adding a final, cruel layer of inevitability to a battle already steeped in infamy. From the fury of a modern nor'easter, we travel back to the ambition of a single man whose reach was checked by the sky itself. Alexander the Great stood at the banks of the Beas River in 326 BC, the master of a vast empire stretching from Greece to the edge of India. His army had just achieved a brilliant, hard-fought victory against King Porus at the Hydaspes River, a battle that showcased his military genius but cost his veteran Macedonian soldiers dearly. They were weary, homesick after 8 long years of relentless campaigning, and the lush, alien landscape of India felt like the very edge of the world. Then the monsoon arrived. For soldiers accustomed to the dry summers of the Mediterranean, the Indian monsoon was a terrifying force of nature. It was not a passing storm, but a season of relentless, atmospheric punishment. The skies opened and did not close. Torrential rains fell day after day, turning roads into impassable rivers of mud and flooding the entire countryside. The humid air rotted their leather armor, rusted their weapons, and ruined their precious bowstrings. The constant damp bred disease, and the morale of the most formidable army in the ancient world, began to dissolve. Alexander, driven by a legendary thirst for conquest, wished to press onward, believing the great Ganges River and its wealthy kingdoms lay just beyond the horizon. But his men had reached their breaking point. The monsoon had broken their spirit as no enemy army ever could. They refused to march farther, staging a full mutiny against their beloved king. For the first time, the will of Alexander the Great was overruled by the will of his own soldiers and the oppressive power of the climate. Faced with this impassable environment and the rebellion of his loyal veterans, the great conqueror had no choice but to give the order to turn back. This decision at the Beas River marked the definitive eastern limit of his empire. His dream of a unified world empire stretching to the ends of the earth was washed away by the monsoon rains. The retreat shaped the cultural and political boundaries of the ancient world, ensuring that the deep-rooted civilizations of the Indian subcontinent would develop independently of Hellenistic influence for centuries to come. A seasonal downpour, more than any human enemy, determined where one great civilization ended and another began. A strange, protective stillness settled over the English Channel in late May 1940. On the beaches of Dunkirk, France, the scene was one of utter desperation. Nearly 400,000 British and Allied soldiers were trapped, their backs to the sea, pressed into a shrinking perimeter by the relentless advance of German panzer divisions. From the sky, the dreaded German Luftwaffe swooped down in relentless bombing runs, turning the sands into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel. The British Expeditionary Force, the core of the nation's professional army, faced total annihilation. The survival of Great Britain itself hung in the balance. Then, the weather intervened. A persistent heavy fog mixed with low-lying cloud cover began to form over the channel and the coastline, an atmospheric blanket that clung to the water for days. This was not a gentle mist, but a thick, soupy haze that drastically reduced visibility. For the soldiers waiting in agonizing lines that stretched into the sea, it felt like an eternity of tense, damp cold. But for the German bomber and fighter pilots, this fog was an impenetrable wall. Their dive-bombing tactics, which required clear lines of sight to accurately target the crowded beaches and the ships offshore, became useless. They were blinded, forced to fly above the cloud layer and drop their payloads at random, with little effect. This meteorological gift was the silent partner to the famous flotilla of little ships, the hundreds of civilian vessels that bravely crossed the channel to aid the evacuation, Operation Dynamo. While the courage of those civilian sailors was extraordinary, their mission would have been a suicide run under clear, sunny skies. The fog provided the essential cover that allowed the destroyers and the little boats to make continuous, round-the-clock trips without being spotted and sunk from the air. Over the course of 9 critical days, this weather-borne shield helped save over 338,000 men. The successful evacuation was hailed as a miracle, a testament to the famous Dunkirk spirit. But that spirit required a very practical kind of help from the atmosphere. Had the channel been blessed with clear, calm weather, the Luftwaffe would have destroyed the evacuation fleet, and the war might have ended that summer with a German victory. Instead, a bank of fog ensured that an army lived to fight another day, preserving the core of the force that would eventually return to liberate Europe. A profound drought had been tightening its grip on the steppes of Central Asia for years. Paleoclimatologists, studying the rings of ancient trees and the layers of lakebed sediment, have found stark evidence of a megadrought in the 1340s, a period of relentless aridity that shattered the fragile balance of life on the plains. This was not merely a lack of rain, it was an ecological catastrophe that set the stage for a far greater horror. The grassy lands that supported vast populations of marmots and other rodents withered and died. As their natural food sources vanished, these animals, many of which carried fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis bacterium, were driven by desperation. They abandoned their desolate fields and swarmed into the one place where sustenance remained, the bustling trading posts and caravanserais of the Silk Road. In these cramped, grain-filled human settlements, the infected fleas found a new, abundant food source: people. The plague, which had likely smoldered for centuries in isolated rodent colonies, now had a bridge into the global population. From these Central Asian hubs, the disease hitched a ride on the very networks that connected the world, traveling west with merchants and their cargo along the Silk Road. It reached the Crimean port of Kaffa in 1347, and from there, rat-infested Genos trading ships carried the Black Death across the Mediterranean to Europe. The pandemic that followed was apocalyptic, wiping out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in just a few years. The social and economic consequences were revolutionary. With so many laborers dead, the feudal system, built on a vast supply of cheap serf labor, crumbled. Survivors could demand higher wages and better conditions, empowering the common people and fundamentally shifting the structure of society. A distant drought, by forcing a desperate convergence of rodents and humans, did not just cause a famine. It unlocked a plague that reshaped the medieval world and set it on a path toward the modern era. From the deserts of Central Asia to the shores of Dunkirk, the story remains the same. A typhoon, a fog, or a simple shift in the wind has proven time and again to be more decisive than the greatest generals or the most powerful empires. We have seen fleets shattered by divine winds, revolutions saved by a timely freeze, and entire civilizations brought to their knees not by invaders, but by a long, silent drought. These 25 moments reveal a hidden history, one where the atmosphere is not merely a backdrop, but a primary character, an unpredictable and unstoppable force that redirects the flow of human events. The common thread woven through these tales is our own fragile relationship with the natural world. We are locked in a perpetual struggle against its power, yet our survival is entirely dependent on its mercy. Our greatest plans are ultimately at the whim of the sky. The next time you check the forecast, remember, you might be looking at the forces that are shaping the world of tomorrow. Which of these historical weather events do you think had the most profound impact? Share your own favorite stories of how the weather changed history in the comments below, and subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries of our past.